Hey everybody, if you are watching this, it's because you don't really have much to do and you just decided to watch some random guy rant about things. Well, thank you for your time. I promise that I won't bore you with, well, I might. I can't guarantee you anything. The point is that I'm very grateful that you decided to come onto this channel and watch me rant. I already had a video up, kind of a test video to talk about gaming. But now I actually want to talk about something different and share it live. As always, if you are watching this and you really want to share your opinions, please go to the live chat. It's open. If you're interested in the channel, we specialize in video games and game shows, anything gamer related. Sorry if I'm fiddling with my earbuds. I hate AirPods. I don't even know why the fuck I'm wearing these. I think it's just because I want to make sure that my sound quality is good. But anyway, um, today I figured that I wanted to spend this Sunday morning talking about pretty much my interest of game shows. Because if you really know who I am, or at least been watching this channel long enough, you would know that there are two things that I love: video games and game shows, right? I love gaming in various ways. I think about games in various fashions. And one thing that I love about gaming is the whole idea of the whole game show model that's been around. I'm taking this crap off for ages. And the one thing that has been on my mind for a while has always been the question of why have there been game shows that have been around for ages, or really famous game shows that have been hosted by the legends that are amazing shows, but have the shittiest end games I've ever seen. Now, for those aren't really aware of what the hell I'm talking about when I'm talking about an end game, it's the same logic with a video game, right? There's the main game, you face the so-called, enemies, and then you defeat them. And then ultimately, before you end the level, there's the final boss, right? There's a boss stage. Game shows are in the same predicament, right? There's the main front game where all the contestants are playing and they play the game, and whoever performs the best gets to play an end game for whatever the grand prize is, right? So what I want to do is I kind of want to talk about three game shows that I love to death, that, and I say love to death because I think that the ideas of these game shows are amazing. And in fact, one of the game shows that I'm going to talk about is a game show that I grew up watching, and it's, to me, considerably my all-time favorite game show there is. Like, if anyone asked me what is my favorite game show, you're going to know in this video, because I'm going to talk about how shitty their end games are. So there are three examples that I want to share. And the first example that I want to share is not my favorite game show, but I want to mention it because it's a very notable game show that people, I'm pretty certain if you've been watching game shows in your life, you probably ran into this. And it's called The Joker's Wild, which was a Jack Barry game show, which was initiated in the late 60s, became very popular in the 70s, continued in the 80s with Bill Cullen as the replacement to Jack Barry once he passed away. Got revitalized in the 90s, although it was a totally different game show, and we'll talk about why. And heck, it even got revitalized to now. Snoop Dogg even hosted the game show The Joker's Wild. So if you're a game show fan and you haven't heard of The Joker's Wild, do your homework and watch it, because it is arguably the one of the few game shows that has figured out a way to rear its head back into television since its inception of the early to mid 60s. So for those that don't know The Joker's Wild, the object of the game is that it's kind of like a casino type of game. You're playing a big ass slot machine full of categories. And depending on the type of selection you get, renders the amount of money you can possibly win. So, for example, there's a set of categories that you can choose from. You pull from a slot lever, and then, like a slot machine, it rolls out various categories. Sometimes you might get different categories all around, and there's like 3 different screens. So there's a possibility you might get 3 different categories. There's a possibility you might match one of the categories, but you still might have an odd one, or you might match all of them. And depending on what you match determines the amount of cash you can win. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because when you watch The Joker's Wild, there's some strategy behind it a little. Like if you're very strong on a category and it pops up and there's doubles or triples, or in other words, matches of the same category you're good at, you wouldn't mind taking the risk of going for that category because there's a higher payoff. You're really good at that category. Or, you know, you might see a multitude of categories, although they don't pay off as much as the matches. You kind of want to go for the sure thing to get the sure cash, right? So there's a level of strategy. Now, the reason why I think that this game show is amazing but has the shittiest end game I've ever seen is because their end game is so mindless, right? That it doesn't take a rocket scientist to play it. In fact, the end game was so mindless that they created an audience participation game from the same pointless concept that they were selling to their regular contestants. So here's the end game. The end game is called Beat the Joker. All right. So using the same principle where you're, pulling from a slot lever, there's dollar amounts that will appear randomly, similar to what you see on a slot machine. Your job is to accumulate as much money as possible without hitting the devil. That's it. That is the end game. All you're doing is you're pulling a lever, and you're hoping you don't hit the dragon. And the reason why I hate this damn idea is because I hate it where, you work your ass off in the main game to try to get to the bonus round, because that's where all the big prizes are coming out. And the only way you can win those prizes is not really skill, it's luck. And I'm like, really? Like, why would you bust your ass to go through all this work to win the main game in the hopes that you can win your big prize by luck? I think that, there shouldn't. I really don't like the fact that game shows use that model because they think it's entertaining, and maybe it is, but it's so brainless in terms of the overall idea of the game show where, there should be skill involved. Otherwise, we should just do reality TV. So fuck that. And you know what's the sad part of it all? It really didn't improve all that much over the years. I know that when they revived The Joker's Wild in the 90s, which, by the way, was actually not a bad show. I mean, they changed it a lot. I mean, it was no longer so much about your classic Q&A. It was more about definitions and words. Okay, that's cool. Scrabble was a thing in the 90s. So, it doesn't surprise me that other production companies that make game shows might jump on that sort of bandwagon. But at least with the 90s version of The Joker's Wild, there was some level of there was a challenge involved, right? You didn't just go to face the so-called dragon, or sorry, and I say face the dragon because the logic of what occurred from the Joker's Wild bonus round is kind of similar to Tic-Tac-Doe. Again, another amazing game show hosted by one of the greats, Wink Martindale. But the end game was so stupid because it's just like all you're going to do is just guess numbers in the hope that you can get tick or tack or accumulate a number of cash without hitting the dragon. It's like, it's so anticlimactic versus the strategy that you put into a game show like Tic-Tac-Toe, where it's more than just, beating somebody in a classic game of Tic-Tac-Toe, but you have to answer questions. And the trivia questions wasn't a walk in the park, easy thing to defeat. But the reason why I bring up Tic-Tac-Toe with the Joker's Wild is that here's some game shows that their front game was amazing, but their end game was so boring and so pointless and contradicts the whole idea of the game itself. And I just felt so upset about it because I'm like, what's the fucking point? Seriously, like, what's the point in a world where you're going to do all this work and you might randomly win or you might randomly lose? I just found it to be a piece of shit. Now, another game show that I want to mention, and this one is the one that I mentioned as I teased earlier, is from one of my all-time favorite game shows. If you ever ask me, Aubrey, what is your favorite game show of all time? I'm going to tell you my favorite game show of all time is Sale of the Century. Yes, Sale of the Century. I'm talking about the 1980 American rendition of Sale of the Century, hosted by, in my opinion, one of the greatest game show hosts of all time that you really don't even know. If you're not really deep into game shows, I'm pretty certain you don't really know who this person is. If you're a game show fan, you will kind of understand why I respect this person named James Perry. But Sale of the Century was one of my favorite game shows, still is, because I love the whole gimmick of the show. The whole idea is that it's America's greatest bargain sale. Like, if you know how to answer questions, you can earn sales dollars that you can spend on these lavish, luxurious prizes that would cost you thousands of dollars, and you're paying like maybe 10 or a few tens or a few $100s to accumulate. For example, imagine you want to buy a Mercedes valued at nearly $40,000 for under $400. That was the only game show that gave you that opportunity to do that, depending on your ability to not just answer questions correctly, but also steer away from temptation. Oh my God, I said the word temptation. If you're a game show fan, you would understand why that word temptation and Sale of the Century don't mix. I'll get to that in a second. But the point is that Sale of the Century was a great game show because the idea behind it was amazing. It's been around since the 60s. It was popular overseas, and it really got hype in the 80s. And growing up, I was a 90s baby. I was a 90s baby. I'm alive right now. I am a 90s baby. So growing up in the 90s, I had the USA Network. My grandparents had cable. So I would go to my grandparents' house and I would watch game shows all day. So watching Sale of the Century was the norm, And the one thing that I always appreciated was the challenge of the fast-paced Q&A and the ability to try to fight your temptations in order to, buy the more lavish prizes later on. But the one thing that bothered me, the one thing that really annoyed me was the fact that the end game to the show was so anticlimactic than the regular game itself. Now, that your game show, as awesome as it may be, has problems when you have to change, when you have to constantly shift and change and reshuffle, when you constantly have to redo your end game because it's so boring or so anticlimactic, that's a problem, right? That's an issue. So, for instance, in the original non-syndicated version of Sale of the Century in the 80s, the object is you obtain as much money as possible so that if you win the game, you can go shopping for the big prizes. And essentially, you have to have a certain amount of dollars to get access to certain type of big prizes. So if I wanted a mink coat valued at $5,500 for only $110, I would have to win the game and have at least $110 to then buy the mink coat. But here's the thing. If I buy the mink coat, then my run on the show is over. I have to then resign, which is lame, right? It's kind of like the shittiest way to persuade somebody to now have to come back to the show because, if you watch the main game, you're not winning a lot of cash up front. And the only way you're winning prizes is if you're doing instant bargains. And that's assuming you might get an instant bargain bonus and win cash on the side. So you might win a few $100s here or there. But the point is that you're not winning a lot of cash up front. So the whole incentive is that, yeah, we want you to stay on this show as long as possible. So we're going to put all the awesome prizes at cash amounts where you're going to have to return over and over. And that's the risk, right? Like, you don't know. You might have a hot game one day and then the next day you might be knocked out. Or you might have a hot game one day and then the next game you're playing like trash and somehow you win. And then still you don't have enough money. And I never really, I understood why they did that. I get it. I wasn't really a huge fan of it, but it made sense. But was it a great end game? No. You know why? Because it wasn't a fucking end game. Period. Right? The thing that I did not like about Sale the Century is that it didn't really have an end game. And if I was the producer of the show and I wanted to produce it and I had to make some changes and I needed to make an end game, you'll learn about that in a moment. But there would have been an easy way to make an end game for Sale the Century that would have stayed consistent to really the whole theme of the show. So Red Grundy Productions realized that, yeah, your really awesome big hit game show has a shitty end game or lack thereof. So what did they do? They created a brand new end game called the Winners Board. Now, the Winners Board, quite frankly, was ridiculously so boring to watch. It was just as boring as the first idea of their end game, which I don't even think there was an end game for, but let's just call it an end game. Their second version of their end game was just as pointless because here's the thing. What Sale the Century, what Red Grundy Productions realized is that, yeah, you have an awesome show and it's really addictive as a classic Q&A, but you're not giving out awesome prizes like the other game shows. Remember, this is the 80s. They're competing against game shows like Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, Let's Make a Deal, Concentration, right? Like, Password Plus, Super Password, right? There are a lot of good game shows that are, the Price is Right, excuse me, right? So there's a lot of competitive game shows that are coming out from the big channels like CBS, ABC, NBC. And, Sale the Century was an NBC program before it really got syndicated and was shown all over the country. So for Sale the Century to keep up, what they did is that they made it easier for contestants to win big prizes and don't have to stay on the show for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days to win it. So they came up with this very lame ass idea of the Winners Board. Essentially, there are, I believe, 20 to 25 numbers that you select. So anytime you select a number, a prize is then revealed. And your job is to come up with a pair of prizes that you can then win. That's it. That's it. That is the end game. The end game is you just pick a bunch of numbers, prizes reveal itself, and your job is to match the prizes. That is just as boring as the first fucking idea. What's even worse is that you think that you've made it competitive or challenging because now you just added the element of random surprise. To be honest, I would have rather preferred the first option where I would have just gone in levels and then hope that, I'm competitive enough to make enough money to get the prizes that I want. And for them to think that a better version of the end game would simply be, hey, let's just like randomly put prizes on a board and then you just, pick prizes randomly because you're just picking numbers. One day you might have had one of the hardest games and you're like, yeah, I won. I can't believe I made it. And then you randomly select some prizes that don't really mean shit to you. Imagine you're trying so hard to get a car and you can never match that son of a bitch. And then you lose. And then the next future champion, they match that shit in one effort. Yeah, that's fair, right? That is the fairest way to make a champion feel like a champion. Again, fucking boring and ridiculous. And you know what? Red Grundy Productions knew that. So guess what they did? They changed the end game again. By this time, Sail the Century became a syndicated show, which I was very happy because, of course, it's one of my favorite game shows, hosted by one of my all-time favorite game show hosts. But this time, by the time they're at the peak end of their series, you just knew that the show was falling off. And the end game pretty much sealed the deal. Because now what they did near the tail end of the series, they came out with this fucking ridiculous end game where now you're doing word puzzles. Yeah, that's right. You're playing this big money winners end game, whatever the fuck they called it, where essentially you would have envelopes that you would need to select, and in each of the envelopes contain subjects that you have to figure out. And Jim Perry would read a bunch of one-word clues for you to then figure out. Your job is to try to solve 4 of those puzzles in under 20 seconds. And if you do it the first time, I believe you win 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000, and then 6,000, and 7,000, and 8,000. And then if you win it 5 times, I think you win $10,000 and a car. Like, it was so different from the actual game show itself. And that was the big problem I had with it. It was like, what the fuck is this? This is not Sail of the Century. I don't know what the hell this is. I don't understand why this exists. This is like one of the prime examples of like, you know what? Maybe your game show doesn't need an end game. Have you thought about that? Like, have you just thought like, maybe we should have just left it alone and just kept it the way it is? Like, it's not perfect, but the other versions didn't help at all. Right? Because randomly selecting numbers to match prizes is not a challenge. In fact, it could be totally unfair. Just having word puzzle clues as a way for you to win money, which has nothing to do with the game itself, just really made the show fucking awkward. Remember I said that if I was a game show host, a game show producer or a game show creator, what would I do to fix this issue? I got an idea. This is what I would do. What I would do is, if you've watched the show Sail of the Century, there's a segment called the Fame Game. And on the Fame Game, you have an opportunity to win, either prizes, cash, but most importantly, sales dollars. What I would do is that I would have a running clock. I would have 60 seconds. And I would essentially give you the same process that I would do with the Fame Game. I would read a bunch of clues. It would be either a person, a place, or a thing. And your job is to give me the correct answer based off of the clues I give you. And every time you give me a correct answer, you earn a spin. And then at the end, you turn it into an opportunity to get sales dollars. And what I would do to make it very interesting is that, in the main game, when you play the fame game, they would put a $10 money card, a $15 money card, a $25 money card on the board. In the end game, I would put a $50 money card, a $100 money card, a $150 money card. I would put $5,000. I would put I would put like pointless prizes that aren't really that great, but they're really good consolation prizes. And I would still keep the same element of your job is to earn X amount of money to earn the big prizes. So I would still keep the Mercedes that's valued at $45,000 at $450, but I'm making it easier for you to get to that amount by you playing the end game. And it stays consistent with the game because it's based on the fame game. The same thing that you've already done from the regular version, from the main game. You see, that's the point. I respect the fact when you have an end game that is consistent to your main game. Scrabble, one of my all-time other favorite game shows of all time. Also a Red Grundy production. Perfect example of a game show that has an end game that makes sense. Object of the game is to try to solve 3 puzzles on the Scrabble board. And if you do, you go to the next round where you set up a sprint time. Because now it's not about can you solve the puzzle, it's now about how fast you can do it. And the first time you go up, that's the person that sets the time. In the second half, the person that wins the main game has to beat the time that was set up by the player in the first half. And if the second player can do it, they become the champion. If not, the person that set the time, they become the champion. And then the end game is a bonus sprint. You got 2 words, you got 10 seconds, solve it. Easy. Easy. In terms of just the approach and the simplicity, that's why I love Scrabble. The only issue I had with Scrabble is that they didn't give away a lot of money. But the whole idea of the game, genius. I'm shocked they haven't revived it back today. And if you haven't seen Scrabble, hosted by Chuck Worry, you better do your homework, son. You better do your homework, girl. But going back to Sale of the Century, they could have made the game, especially the end game, consistent to the main game and not make these random ass games that have nothing to do with the show. It's so stupid, and it made it so terrible that, a show that should have lasted longer than 6 years, it made sense why it died in 6 years. It made total sense. Now, I mentioned Temptation. Remember, Sale of the Century ultimately got revived in the early 2000s. And it got a brand new look. It got rebranded, in fact. It was no longer called Sale of the Century. It was called Temptation, the new Sale of the Century. First off, that's a dumbass name for a game show. Why the fuck do you have one title with a subtitle? I mean, this is not a fucking essay. You don't need to do that. Like, that's so dumb. Just call it Sale of the Century. We know what the fuck it is. Or just call it Temptation. But to say it's Temptation, the new Sale of the Century, I'm like, no shit. We didn't realize that this was Sale of the Century, but a shittier version. You think we didn't figure that out already? Your host is trash. Y'all changed up the game show completely, right? Like, it's barely recognizable. And then the end game got me super tight because, I get it. Sale of the Century never really had a true end game to begin with. So anything that they could invent could actually be a step up. The problem that I have with their end game is that y'all just totally stole a game show's premise and turned it into an end game for your show. That is so shit-tacular. Really? Like, if you've watched the game show Hitman, pretty good game show back in the 80s, to be honest, that was a slept-on game show. That game show should have been on longer than it lasted. Hosted by Peter Tomarken, again, legend. And the object of the game is pretty simple. You get a subject, There are X number of possible answers. There's a bunch of answers that will be displayed. Some are right, some are wrong. Your job is to find the correct answers. And every time you do, you win cash. The end. So what do you think Sell the Century did? They stole a game show premise and then they put it as the end game. Oh, by the way, it wasn't even an end game, to be honest with you, because they actually did it as a replacement to the Fame game, which was so stupid. It was so lame. It was so unoriginal. It's like, the Fame game in the original version, not only was it not bad, I actually enjoyed it because it was the most challenging. That's the thing. The Fame game was very challenging because you start off with a very obscure trivia fact, and then you wind down to the most obvious until you finally get to solve it. So to me, it's like, why would you take away, in my opinion, one of the greatest components to the show and then replace it with some other game show gimmick as an end game? Like, you guys just don't give a fuck. Like, you just don't care. Because to me, it bothers me that when you finally have the opportunity to bring back a worldwide hit, because Sale of the Century wasn't just popular in the United States, it was popular all over the world. We're talking about it was popular in New Zealand and Australia, which would make sense because, Red Grundy's from that neck of the woods. It was popular in Europe, like, for instance, Great Britain, right? So this was an international hit, right? This is not some flash in the pan bullshit game show. No, this was popular. Like, you saw how Millionaire became a international household hit. So was Sale of the Century. In fact, some countries, I believe, still do the show to this day. So the point that I'm trying to raise here is that the end game makes an amazing classic game show look like trash. And the game show itself should have stayed on for many years. And I felt like if they would have had a better end game, it would have been really a household hit even to this day. The last game show that I want to stress, and then I'm going to stop talking because it's been over 30 minutes, was a game show that I really appreciated because of its uniqueness. It was created by Monty Hall and his partner. I forgot, it was a Stefan Matos. And they created this game show called Split Second. If you've ever seen the game show, it initiated in the 70s on ABC. And I loved it. I think that the general premise of the game show was super interesting, right? So imagine you get a question, or in this case, a subject. The subject that's presented to you has 3 questions, basically, and your job is to find the easiest question to answer. So, for example, if we were playing Split Second, and let's say the category is football, I'm going to name you 3 NFL franchises, and you're going to tell me their location. You see, that's the gimmick. That's how they played the game, and I really liked it because it's like, wow, it's one of those game shows where it's very open-ended. So you'll get like a subject, and there's mad multiple answers. Your job is to find the easiest, part for you to answer, right? Because using my example for instance, if the subject was football and I said, I will give you 3 franchises and your job is to tell me where they're located, and I say New York Jets or I wouldn't even say New York Jets. I would say Jets, Chargers, and Raiders, right? Your job is to try to find the easiest one and answer it as quickly as possible. Because whoever answers the question correctly, you get a piece of the pie, you see? Because if one person gets the correct answer out of 3, because it's a 3-person game, if 1 out of the 3 gets the answer, then that one person gets a huge cash amount. And when I say huge, it's the 70s. I'm talking about $100. You know what I'm saying? If 2 got it right, then it's 50. If 3 got it right, it's 20. Now, they brought back this game show in the 80s, and I'm going to talk about the 80s version in a moment, but the 70s version, their end game was very mindless. For a cerebral type of game show like Split Second, it was very mindless because the end game was so basic. Like, all you do, if you watch the beginning of the game show, there's a pageantry of cars that are laid out. And the way that the studio is designed, if you ever watched the game show Classic Concentration hosted by Alex Trebek in the 80s, and you saw like a pageantry of cars, down like a staircase, Sail of the Century had that same design in the 70s, right? And so at the end of the game, if you win, and I'm not even going to talk about their final round, I'm going to mention that in the 80s version in a moment. But in the end game, if you beat the game, all you have to do is guess of which one of the 5 cars, because they'll show you like 5, 6 automobiles. And your job is to guess which of those cars will actually turn on, right? Because you have to like find a car, go inside, turn the ignition. And if the ignition turns and the car starts, then it's your car. And you win like a bonus cash prize. Boring. A guessing game. You do all this work answering all these questions, trying to not only answer the question correctly, but get it in as fast as possible. And then for the big grand prize, it all comes down to luck. Come on. Come on. Like, that is such shit. And then when Monty Hall decides to bring the game show back in the 80s, number one, he brought it back to Canada. He didn't keep it in California, where it originally was shot in the 70s when it was hosted and produced by ABC. So the number one thing you got to know off rip, and if you know your Canadian game show history, you would know that Canadian game shows in the 70s and 80s are cheap as fuck. They give away the cheapest, crappiest prizes because, there's like a law in Canada in terms of how much money and cash and prizes you can give away. Like, literally. It's the same thing in Great Britain, right? That's why if you ever watch like these game shows in Europe, especially like in Britain, and these are some like cerebral type, really hard game shows. Like, if you ever watch the game show Countdown, one of the most cerebral games I have ever watched, ever. And the winner wins a clock. Yeah. Well, this is where we're at with game shows in Canada. So, what I told you, when you play the game, if you get one question right, you get $100, 2 for 50, 3 for 200, 20. That price model would make a lot of sense in the 70s because, shit was cheap back then. But this is the late 80s. The late 80s. And they're giving out the same cash values. Cheap as fuck. And you know what's interesting? The final round of the show, in my opinion, should have been the end game, period. Now, what I didn't mention about the 70s version, which also occurred in the 80s version, is something called the countdown round. So on the show, Split Second, by the end of the second round, whoever has the most amount of money will have the opportunity of moving on, where in the final round, everyone gets to play, and they play the same game of Sail the Century, of Split Second, but the only difference now is that rather than, the host gives a question or a subject with multiple parts and everybody gets a piece of the action, nope. This time around, it's all about buzzing in as quickly as possible, because if you buzz in correctly and you get one of the parts correct, you get to continue. Ultimately, giving you the opportunity to answer all 3 parts of the question by yourself. And that's important because in the countdown round, you're counting down how many questions you need to answer in order for you to complete the game. So if you're in first place, you get the advantage of answering with the least amount of questions required, right? So that's like 4 questions. You got to get 4 questions right. If you're in second place, you get 5. If you're in last place, you get 6. So how much money you've earned in the first 2 rounds really doesn't matter. If you're trying to win the game and make it to the end game, it's not about where you start, it's how you finish. And that's, to me, I love that idea. I really appreciate it because it creates that underdog type of vibe. You know, like suppose you're having a shitty day and you're in third place, but then you're getting these subjects and you're on a hot streak, and before you know it, you finish your shit first. You answer 6 questions by yourself first, thus making you the champion of the show. I love it. I love it. And quite frankly, that should have been the end of the show. That should have been the end of the show. What I would have done is that I would have left it just like that. Whoever wins, you win $5,000 on top of whatever money you won on the first 2 rounds, and you remain the champion. You win 5 days in a row, you win an automatic car plus $50,000 or some shit. I don't know. Or I would have just gave you a car after 5 days. But I would have given you $2,500 for making it first place, and you would be the champion. Because the end game to the 80s version of Split Second was so stupid. It was so boring. So their version of their end game, there are 5 monitors, and all you do is guess which of the 5 monitors says the word car. And that's it. How is that even consistent to the game show? Well, you can say that about the first version too. How is that consistent to the fucking game show? Don't understand. You see, the thing that bothers me is that I don't like it when you got a good idea for a game show and then you don't know how to end it. And so you come up with a clusterfuck rather than just ending the shit. You don't see Jeopardy coming out with an end game. Oh, yeah, they kind of did, actually. You know, in the 80s, they had like an end game on Jeopardy where if you win the game, you get to go to Super Jeopardy bonus round, some bullshit, where you have to like answer a bunch of clues in a certain way. And if you do, you win an additional $5,000. Like the fact that I'm barely remembering this shit showed how relevant that model of an end game was. But you see, notice how game shows like Jeopardy choose not to fucking, I'm sorry, I have to put my charger in before this thing disconnects because the battery's gonna run out. But again, notice how good game shows don't complicate or make the game far than what it needs to be. They don't need to create a gimmick because, if you got a good game, you don't need to make it more than what it is. I wish that these 3 examples that I gave followed that same principle. If you have a good gimmick for a game show, then either your end game needs to be consistent to the gimmick of the main game, or don't do it at all. Like if I had to do the Joker's Wild, what I would do is I would make the end game the same as the main game where you have categories, but this time you're playing for more money. And you're not playing for no damn devil. All you're doing is you're accumulating cash. And if you can get up to $1,000, not only do you get to keep the cash, you win the bonus prizes. Fuck this devil bullshit because it's not consistent to the main game. There's no devil in the main game. Now, you see, and that's the thing. If they would have had a devil component in the main game where it's like, oh, well, we're going to play Joker's Wild, but we have this component called the Joker. Not the Joker, the devil. We already know what the Joker is. The Joker allows you to basically select any category you want. If you get 3 Jokers, you get to select your own category, and then you win the game automatically if you win it. But what I'm trying to say with this face the devil bullshit, if I was the producer or the creator and I had to fix it, what I would do is I would essentially put the devil component in the main game, kind of like a bankrupt on Wheel of Fortune. If you pull the lever and you hit a devil, you lose your cash and you lose your turn. Because, you see, it would add more excitement to the game. It makes it a bit more challenging. Yeah, it's unfair, but Joker's Wild, it's all about luck, right? And then when you do the face the devil bullshit as the end game, at least there's some level of consistency. At least you don't have to see another element of the game that's not even comparative to what is from the main game. You see, my criticism is very simple. It's all about consistency. If you are consistent in terms of what the main game is to your end game, then it can be a heap of garbage, but at least it would make sense. These three examples, they're just drawing straws in the hopes that it can just gather enough attention for people to watch. And if that's the way you're playing that, you're not going to get a lot of fans. You're not going to get a lot of people watching, including diehards like myself. And we've seen what happened as a result of it. We only now know them as classics because they wouldn't survive today because the game would be boring and it wouldn't make any sense. But you know what? I don't know. Maybe that's not true. If you sit and think about it, maybe that's not true at all, because now we have game shows where you don't even need any lick of intelligence to be a millionaire anymore. Seriously, there is a game show that is the equivalent to Plinko. Yes, there's trivia elements to it, but it's so gimmicky. It's like, boring. Deal or No Deal. Pretty much an over gimmicky version of Treasure Hunt. I'm just saying, I love game shows, but I do respect game shows that take the effort to make it not just entertaining, but challenging and consistent to its overall premise of the game. Which is why The Price is Right will never go anywhere. Which is why Family Feud will never go anywhere. Which is why Jeopardy will never go anywhere. They will exist until the end of time, not because the game is just fun to play, but it just makes a lot of sense playing it. And that's all I'm asking.